Everyone knows the Spitfire. Say British fighter, and that's the image that flashes into your mind. The elegant elliptical wings, the graceful curves, the Merlin engine's distinctive growl. The Spitfire won the Battle of Britain. The Spitfire saved democracy. The Spitfire is practically a national symbol. But there was another British fighter. Faster, flew lower, and during the summer of 1944 it hunted Hitler's V-1 flying bombs out of the sky, while Spitfires struggled to keep up. It was called the Hawker Tempest, and it doesn't get the recognition it deserves. That phrase, "doesn't get the recognition it deserves," isn't my opinion. It's what aviation enthusiasts have been saying for decades. Because when you actually look at the numbers, when you examine what this aircraft accomplished and what it led to, the Tempest has a genuine claim to being Britain's finest piston-engined fighter of the entire war. Not the Spitfire, not the Hurricane, the Tempest. So why have you probably never heard of it? Let me tell you the story, and by the end, you'll understand not just what the Tempest was, but why it matters, and why its erasure from popular memory is one of the strangest oversights in aviation history. To understand the Tempest, you first need to understand the disaster that came before it. Because the Tempest wasn't designed from scratch, it was born from desperation. It was the answer to an aircraft that was killing its own pilots. That aircraft was the Hawker Typhoon. The Typhoon first flew in February 1940, designed by Sidney Cam, the same brilliant engineer who'd created the Hurricane. Cam intended the Typhoon as the Hurricane's successor, a heavy, powerful interceptor built around the Napier Sabre, the most powerful piston engine Britain had ever produced. On paper, it looked magnificent. In reality, it was a death trap. Pilots started dying. Not in combat, just dying. Aircraft would enter dives and never recover. Others would simply break apart in mid-air, no enemy anywhere near them. The cause, when investigators finally identified it, was horrifying. The Typhoon's rear fuselage was structurally inadequate. The transport joint, that's the bolted connection where the tail section attached to the forward fuselage, just behind the cockpit, couldn't handle the stress loads of high-speed flight. Under certain conditions, particularly during high-speed dives or sharp pullouts, catastrophic stress concentrated at this joint. The entire tail would tear away from the aircraft. Pilots called it shed tail disease. The name sounds almost darkly humorous until you realize what it meant. One moment you're flying, the next moment you're tumbling through the sky in the front half of an aircraft with the tail section spiraling away behind you. No chance of recovery, no chance of escape, just a long fall and a violent end. Between 1942 and 1943, at least 23 Typhoons were lost to structural failure. Not combat, structural failure. 23 pilots dead because their aircraft simply fell apart around them. The Air Ministry seriously considered cancelling the whole programme. But that wasn't even the full extent of the problems. The Typhoon's thick wing, necessary to accommodate the fuel and armament required for a heavy interceptor, created unacceptable compressibility effects at high speed. At altitude, where the thin air should have favoured such a powerful engine, the Typhoon's performance actually declined relative to lighter fighters. The aircraft that was supposed to be a high-altitude interceptor couldn't actually intercept anything at high altitude. Then there was the cockpit. Carbon monoxide from the Sabre engine leaked through imperfect seals, literally poisoning pilots as they flew. Men would return from missions feeling dizzy, nauseous, disoriented, symptoms that could be fatal during combat maneuvering. The massive chin radiator created enormous drag. Centre of gravity issues made the aircraft twitchy and unforgiving, particularly during landing. For an interceptor, which is what the Typhoon was supposed to be, the aircraft was essentially useless in its intended role. Sidney Cam knew all of this. And even as Typhoon squadrons struggled with their deadly machines, he was already working on the solution. On November 18, 1941, the Air Ministry ordered 2 prototypes of what was initially called the Typhoon II. But within months, everyone realized this wasn't a modification. This was something fundamentally different. The designation changed to Tempest, and the Tempest would fix everything. 2 prototypes took shape at Hawker's facilities. The first, serial number HM595, would become the Tempest 5, retaining a refined version of the Typhoon's chin radiator to speed production. The second, HM599, was designated Tempest 1, featuring an experimental wing-mounted radiator installation that promised even lower drag. Both aircraft represented CAM's determination to solve the Typhoon's problems, while pushing the boundaries of what a piston fighter could achieve. HM595 took off from Hawker's airfield at Langley on the 2nd of September 1942. Test pilot Philip Lucas was at the controls. What he experienced that day was a revelation. The aircraft looked like a Typhoon. Same general shape, same distinctive chin radiator, same family resemblance that marked all of CAM's designs. But it flew like something from a different world. The responsiveness, the stability, the sheer sense of controlled power. Lucas knew immediately that this was no mere modification. This was a new aircraft wearing familiar clothes. Here's what CAM and his team had done. The wing was completely new. Where the Typhoon had a thick, straight-edged wing with a chord of over 9 feet, the Tempest received a semi-elliptical wing with a maximum thickness-to-chord ratio of just 14.5% at the root, tapering to 10% at the tip. Thinner. Much thinner. This wasn't arbitrary. It directly addressed the compressibility problems that had plagued the Typhoon at high speed. But there was something else about that wing, something the audience for this video will appreciate. The Tempest featured laminar flow wings. For those unfamiliar with the term, a laminar flow wing is designed to maintain smooth, undisturbed airflow over as much of the wing surface as possible. In normal flight, air passing over a wing quickly becomes turbulent, chaotic, swirling, energy-wasting. Turbulent flow creates drag, which costs speed. A laminar flow wing uses a carefully calculated airfoil shape to delay this transition, keeping the airflow smooth and attached for a greater distance along the wing surface. The physics are elegant. Laminar flow creates far less skin friction than turbulent flow. By pushing the transition point further back along the wing, sometimes as far as 30 or 40% of the chord before turbulence inevitably develops, you get measurably less drag across the entire speed range. The Tempest's wing, drawing on the latest aerodynamic research from both Britain and America, pushed this transition point further back than any previous British fighter. The result was dramatic. Less drag meant higher speeds, particularly at low altitude, where the denser air magnified every advantage. The same engine that struggled to push the thick-winged Typhoon through the air could propel the sleek-winged Tempest significantly faster. But redesigning the wing created a new problem. Thinner meant less internal volume for fuel. So CAM lengthened the fuselage by 21 inches, moved the engine forward, and relocated the main fuel tank ahead of the cockpit. This solved one of the Typhoon's most dangerous characteristics, its rearward center of gravity that made the aircraft unstable and unpredictable, particularly during demanding maneuvers. With the fuel now positioned forward, the Tempest achieved far better balance, safer, more responsive, easier to fly. The kind of aircraft that worked with its pilot rather than against him. And the tail that had killed so many Typhoon pilots? Completely re-engineered. The flawed transport joint was replaced with a reinforced monocoque construction. Rather than relying on a simple bolted connection that concentrated stress at a single point, the new design used strengthened longerons running the full length of the fuselage, distributing loads across a much larger structural area. The entire empennage received new construction methods and increased structural margins. Testing confirmed what the engineers had calculated. The concentration point that had torn Typhoons apart simply didn't exist in the Tempest's structure. The cockpit received improved sealing to prevent carbon monoxide intrusion. A new bubble canopy replaced the Typhoon's car door-style enclosure, giving pilots vastly improved visibility in all directions, a feature that would prove critical in the low-altitude dogfights to come, where seeing your enemy first often meant the difference between killing and being killed. The Tempest 5 could reach 432 miles per hour at sea level. Some aircraft, running 150-octane fuel in optimal conditions, were recorded at speeds approaching 440 miles per hour at sea level. Here's why that matters. Other fighters, the Spitfire 14, the P-51D Mustang, could achieve similar maximum speeds. 430, 440 miles per hour. Impressive numbers. But they hit those figures at high altitude, above 25,000 feet, where the thin air suited their supercharger configurations and airframe designs. At sea level, different story entirely. The P-51D Mustang, that legendary American fighter, managed 375 to 390 miles per hour in the dense air near the ground. The Spitfire 14 topped out at approximately 360 miles per hour at sea level. Both excellent aircraft. Both significantly slower than the Tempest where it mattered most. The Tempest was achieving its competitors' high-altitude speeds while flying at treetop height. In the vital low-altitude regime, where the final battles of the European Air War would be fought, the Tempest was the fastest thing in the sky. British, American, German. Nothing could catch it down low. And that advantage was about to matter more than anyone expected. On June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day, the first V-1 flying bomb struck British soil. Within days, hundreds more followed. The V-1's pulse jet engine produced a sound that terrified Londoners, a harsh, buzzing drone that earned the weapon its nickname, Doodlebug. But the truly terrifying moment came when the buzzing stopped. That meant the fuel had cut off, the engine had died, and the bomb was now falling silently toward whatever lay beneath it. You had perhaps 15 seconds to find cover, sometimes less. The V-1 carried an 1,870-pound warhead, not precision-guided, not particularly accurate, but accuracy hardly mattered when you were raining explosive terror on a densely populated city. Every bomb that reached London killed, on average, 6 people and injured many more. Some struck crowded streets, others hit churches, hospitals, homes. Churchill himself considered the V-1 threat severe enough to potentially disrupt the entire Normandy campaign. If British morale cracked under the robot bomb assault, if workers refused to go to factories, if the home front collapsed, everything else became irrelevant. The British response was Operation Diver, a comprehensive defensive system combining anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, and fighter aircraft, arranged in defensive belts stretching from the Channel coast to London's outskirts. And for the fighters, the challenge was immense. The V-1 flew at approximately 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. Most British fighters could barely match this speed at such low altitude. Even those that could had precious little margin for the interception geometry required to actually hit the target. You couldn't intimidate a robot bomb. You couldn't wound its pilot. The only way to stop a V1 was to physically destroy it or somehow disrupt its flight. This was precisely where the Tempest's unique advantage would prove decisive. The RAF's 150 wing, the first operational Tempest unit, had been established at RAF Newchurch in Kent just weeks before the V1 campaign began. Its commander was Wing Commander Roland Prosper Beaumont, 24 years old, already an ace with victories dating back to his Hurricane days, and one of the pilots who'd been involved in the Tempest's development testing. Beaumont had flown Typhoons on ground attack operations, understood their limitations intimately, and had reported directly to Hawker on operational performance. He knew the Tempest as well as any man alive. His wing comprised 3 squadrons, numbers 3, 56 and 486, Royal New Zealand Air Force. They found themselves perfectly positioned, both geographically and technologically, to meet the V1 threat. Newchurch sat directly in the path the flying bombs took toward London. What followed was one of the most intense fighter campaigns of the war. Tempest pilots would patrol the corridor between the Channel coast and London's anti-aircraft belt, flying standing patrols or scrambling on ground controller vectoring, watching for the telltale flame of V1 pulse jets against the darkness or the summer sky. Upon spotting a target, they dive to intercept, pushing their aircraft to maximum speed. Where a Spitfire pilot at sea level had perhaps 10 or 15 miles per hour advantage over a V1, if any advantage at all, a Tempest pilot had 30 to 40 miles per hour in hand. That margin transformed impossible interceptions into routine ones. A Tempest could spot a V1, chase it down, position for attack, and still have speed in reserve for the kill. The tactics were dangerous, desperately dangerous. The standard approach was to position behind and slightly below the V1, then open fire from 200 to 300 yards. But shooting down a flying bomb wasn't like shooting down an aircraft. That 1,870-pound warhead meant a direct hit could produce an explosion powerful enough to destroy the attacking fighter along with its target. Pilots who closed to point-blank range for a certain kill sometimes didn't survive the explosion they caused. Pilots learned to fire in short, precise bursts, aiming for the wing or the pulse jet motor, then breaking away violently as soon as they saw hits register. You didn't hang around to confirm the kill. You broke hard, pulled away, and looked back to see if the bomb was falling. If you'd done it right, you'd see a trail of fire spiraling earthward over empty countryside. If you'd done it wrong, you might see nothing at all, because you were dead. Some pilots developed an even more audacious technique. The V1's guidance system relied on a gyroscope to maintain stable flight. Disturb that gyroscope significantly, and the bomb would lose its balance and tumble out of control. Pilots discovered that by flying alongside the V1, extremely close alongside, wingtip nearly touching wingtip, they could use the disturbed airflow from their own wing to flip the bomb's control surfaces. The sudden aerodynamic force would overwhelm the gyroscope, and the V1 would roll, stall, and plunge earthward. This tipping maneuver required extraordinary precision. Fly too close, and you risked a collision that would kill you just as surely as the warhead. Too far, and the disrupted airflow wouldn't be strong enough to affect the bomb's stability. The closing speeds were enormous. You had to match velocity with a target doing 400 miles per hour while positioning your wingtip within feet of its surface. Any mistake, any miscalculation, any gust of wind at the wrong moment, catastrophic. The pilots who mastered tipping often did so out of necessity. Ammunition runs out. Guns jam. But the V1 keeps flying toward London, and you're the only thing between it and a crowded street. So you slide in close, closer than any sane person would fly to an object carrying nearly a ton of explosive. And you use your aircraft itself as the weapon. The Tempest's stable handling at high speed made this possible. A twitchier aircraft, one that required constant correction, would have made the maneuver suicidal rather than merely extremely dangerous. The pilots who mastered the tipping technique became legends within the fighter community. They'd return to Newchurch and describe the moment, the tension of closing in, the vibration of their own airframe in the disturbed air, the sudden roll as the V1 lost control and fell away. No ammunition expended, no explosion to fly through, just pure flying skill defeating German engineering. Their names, though, would never achieve the public recognition of Battle of Britain aces. This was a different kind of heroism, repetitive, grinding, statistically dangerous. Anti-diver sorties blurred together into an exhausting routine of scrambles, interceptions, and kills. Beaumont led from the front, as was his nature. On the 8th of June 1944, just 2 days after D-Day, he'd scored the first aerial victory ever credited to a Tempest when he shot down a Messerschmitt Bf-109 over Normandy in his personal aircraft, JN 751. Now, over the fields of Kent, he threw himself into the anti-diver campaign with the same aggression. Wing commanders weren't supposed to fly constant operations. Their administrative and leadership duties were supposed to keep them on the ground much of the time. Beaumont flew anyway, whenever he could, leading his pilots by example. By the time the V1 launch sites were overrun by advancing Allied forces in the autumn of 1944, Beaumont himself had claimed 32 flying bombs destroyed, a remarkable total for someone with wing commander responsibilities. Squadron leader Joseph Berry of 501 Squadron became the highest-scoring V1 ace of the war, 60 flying bombs destroyed. 60 bombs that didn't reach London. 60 times that Berry put himself in position, made the kill, and survived the explosion or avoided the collision. And across all participating squadrons, the Tempest proved devastating. 638 flying bombs destroyed, more than any other aircraft type. The Spitfire 14 managed 303. The Mosquito, with its advantage in night operations, claimed 428. But the Tempest, that overlooked fighter nobody talks about, killed more V1s than anything else in the sky. Every one of those kills was a bomb that didn't reach London. Families that survived, streets that stayed intact, children who grew up to have children of their own. The Tempest's speed advantage at low altitude translated directly into lives saved. But the V1 campaign was only part of the Tempest's war. When the flying bomb threat receded in autumn 1944, Tempest squadrons moved to the continent and found themselves facing the Luftwaffe's most advanced fighters in a very different kind of battle. The Germans had their own answer to Allied air superiority. The Focke-Wulf 190D9, nicknamed Dora, and the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. Both represented the cutting edge of Axis aviation technology. Both were dangerous opponents, and both found the Tempest to be something they hadn't expected. The FW-190D9 was Germany's attempt to match the high-altitude performance of Allied fighters. It replaced the earlier 190's radial engine with a liquid-cooled inline Junkers Umo 213, giving it a longer nose and better high-altitude capability. At altitude, the Dora was a formidable opponent. Fast, well-armed, flown by experienced pilots who knew their aircraft intimately. But the war's final battles weren't being fought at altitude. They were being fought down low, where Tempest pilots lived, strafing airfields, hunting transport, catching German aircraft during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. In this environment, the FW190D9's high-altitude optimization became a liability. The Tempest's low-level speed advantage, that same characteristic that had made it lethal against V1s, gave British pilots the edge in exactly the kind of combat that defined the war's closing months. The Me-262 was a different challenge entirely. Germany's jet fighter could reach speeds over 500 miles per hour, faster than any piston-engined aircraft could hope to match in level flight. On paper, the 262 should have been untouchable. But jets have vulnerabilities. The Me-262's engines were temperamental, slow to spool up, and dangerously unresponsive at low speeds. During takeoff and landing, the 262 was a sitting duck, fast enough to be airborne, but not yet fast enough to escape. And its engines consumed fuel at a prodigious rate, limiting loiter time and forcing predictable patterns around known airfields. Tempest squadrons learned to exploit these weaknesses. They flew rat scramble missions, standing patrols near known 262 bases, waiting for jets to take off or return from operations. The moment a 262 committed to its landing approach, Tempest pilots would pounce. The jet's speed advantage meant nothing when it was gear down and bleeding velocity. The Tempest's acceleration and low-altitude handling meant everything. 122 Wing, operating from Volkel in the Netherlands alongside rocket-armed Typhoons, became particularly adept at these tactics. Their operational record books documented a grim harvest of German jets caught at their most vulnerable. Two statistics from those records tell the story. By war's end, Tempest pilots had destroyed over 240 enemy aircraft, a remarkable tally that included Me-262s, FW190s, and virtually every other type the Luftwaffe could put into the air. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields intended to cripple tactical air power in one devastating blow. Nearly 900 German aircraft participated, catching many Allied units on the ground and destroying hundreds of aircraft. It was the Luftwaffe's last major offensive operation. Tempest squadrons were among those that fought back. Despite the surprise, despite losses on the ground, they got aircraft into the air and into the fight. The low-altitude battle that followed played directly to the Tempest's strengths. German pilots, many of them inexperienced replacements flying unfamiliar routes, found themselves engaged by an aircraft that could match them for speed and outmaneuver them in the dense air near the ground. Bodenplatte cost the Luftwaffe over 200 pilots, losses that could never be replaced. The Tempest contributed to that toll. The pilots who flew Tempests weren't just skilled, they were characters, and some of them left records that still resonate today. Pierre Clostermann was a free French pilot who flew with 3 Squadron RAF. His memoir, The Big Show, published in 1948, remains one of the most acclaimed pilot narratives of the Second World War. A vivid, visceral account that pulls no punches about the terror and exhilaration of air combat. Clostermann's descriptions of flying the Tempest capture something that official reports never could. He wrote about the tremendous power of the Sabre engine, the way it pressed you back into your seat during acceleration. He wrote about the responsive handling that made the aircraft feel alive, an extension of your own body rather than a machine you were merely operating. And he wrote about the particular intensity of low-level combat over occupied Europe. Strafing missions, where you flew through curtains of flak. Ground attack runs, where trees flashed past at eye level. Dogfights, where altitude was measured in tens of feet rather than thousands. His accounts of Tempest operations in the war's final months convey a war very different from the Battle of Britain's high-altitude elegance. This was brutal, close-range work, hunting trains and trucks and troop columns, attacking airfields where German jets were trying to take off, flying in weather that should have grounded everything. Klosterman finished the war with 33 confirmed victories, many scored in Tempests during those frantic final months when the Reich was collapsing but still fighting. Evan Mackey was a New Zealander who'd already made his name flying Spitfires in the Mediterranean. He took command of 80 Squadron in mid-January 1945 and led it through some of the most intense combat of the war's final months. His leadership style, always among the first into danger, never asking his pilots to do anything he wouldn't do himself, epitomized the aggressive spirit that made Tempest squadrons so effective. Number 486 Squadron, RNZAF, one of Beaumont's original units, produced numerous aces. New Zealand contributed disproportionately to Tempest operations. Young men who'd travelled literally halfway around the world to fight for a cause they believed in, and who found in the Tempest a weapon worthy of their determination. The family connections that so many people carry today, those grandfathers' stories passed down through generations, often trace back to Commonwealth pilots like these. Men who trusted their lives to an aircraft that most people have never heard of. Men whose courage deserves to be remembered alongside the more famous names of the Spitfire era. Beaumont himself lived until 2001. After the war, he became one of Britain's most celebrated test pilots, the first British pilot to exceed Mach 1 in level flight, and a key figure in the development of the English Electric Lightning and other jet aircraft. He flew everything Britain produced for 4 decades, and throughout his long life he maintained that the Tempest was the finest fighter he had ever flown. That's not nostalgia speaking. That's the considered opinion of a man who knew what he was talking about. Now here's where the story becomes something larger. Sidney Cam didn't stop designing when the war ended, and the Tempest wasn't a dead end. It was a beginning. Understanding this lineage matters because it reveals a continuous thread of innovation connecting propeller-driven fighters of 1944 to vertical takeoff jets still serving today. Cam himself was a remarkable figure. Born in Windsor in 1893, he joined Hawker in 1923 and became chief designer in 1925 at the remarkably young age of 32. He would remain at Hawker until his death in 1966. More than 4 decades of continuous aircraft design that shaped British aviation across 2 world wars and into the jet age. What made Cam extraordinary wasn't just technical brilliance, it was his relentless evolutionary approach. Each design built upon the lessons of the last. Each aircraft served as a stepping stone to something greater. The Hawker Sea Fury first flew in September 1944 and entered service after the war ended. It was the Tempest's direct descendant, lighter, with improved visibility and handling, but built on the same fundamental philosophy that Cam had refined through the Typhoon and Tempest programs. Many consider the Sea Fury the finest piston-engined fighter ever to serve with the Royal Navy. It would see combat in Korea, where naval aviators who flew it described the aircraft in terms that echoed what Beaumont said about the Tempest: responsive, powerful, a natural extension of the pilot's will. But Cam wasn't done. When jets arrived, he designed the Hawker Hunter, one of the most successful jet fighters of its generation, exported to dozens of air forces around the world, still flying with some operators into the 21st century. The Hunter retained Cam's design sensibilities. Clean lines, superb handling, engineering that prioritized what pilots actually needed in combat. And then came the Harrier. Yes, that Harrier. The vertical takeoff marvel that revolutionized naval and tactical aviation. Sidney Cam, along with his team at Hawker, developed the original P1127 prototype that evolved into the Harrier. The designer who created the Hurricane, who saved the Typhoon program by transforming it into the Tempest, who refined his ideas into the Sea Fury and the Hunter, that same designer gave the world the jump jet. Typhoon to Tempest to Sea Fury to Hunter to Harrier. One lineage, one designer, one philosophy of engineering that prioritized what pilots actually needed. When you skip the Tempest in that story, and some people do skip it, you break the chain. You lose the connection between the piston-engined fighters that won the war and the jets that shaped the Cold War. The audience who knows this history gets angry when it's abbreviated, and rightly so. The Tempest isn't a footnote, it's the crucial middle chapter. So why has the Tempest been written out of popular memory? A few reasons, none of them good. Timing, first of all. The Spitfire became famous during the Battle of Britain in 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany and the whole world was watching. That mythology solidified before the Tempest even existed. The Spitfire was the symbol of British defiance during the darkest days. By the time Tempests were hunting V-1s and dominating the low-altitude air war in 1944, the Spitfire's legend was already unassailable. No amount of superior performance could compete with that emotional resonance. Production numbers mattered too. Approximately 20,000 Spitfires were built across all variants. Fewer than 1,700 Tempests. More Spitfires meant more pilots with Spitfire stories, more squadrons with Spitfire traditions, more surviving aircraft for museums and air shows. The Spitfire is everywhere. The Tempest is rare. And there's the simple fact that the Tempest arrived late. It missed the Battle of Britain. It missed the desperate years of 1940 and 1941, when Britain's survival hung in the balance, when every victory felt miraculous. By the time the Tempest reached squadrons in 1944, victory, though still hard-won and bloody, felt more assured. The Tempest fought in a war that was being won. The Spitfire, in popular memory, fought in a war that might have been lost. None of this diminishes what the Tempest actually was. At low altitude, it was the fastest propeller-driven fighter of the war. It destroyed more V-1s than any other aircraft. It hunted German jets at their most vulnerable. It solved engineering problems that had killed dozens of pilots. And its design DNA flows directly into aircraft that are still legendary today. But popular memory doesn't work on logic. It works on stories told and retold until they become truth. The Spitfire had better stories, or at least stories that were told more often. Here's the thing, though. You now know what the mainstream forgot. You know about the Typhoon's deadly flaws and how Cam fixed them. You know about the laminar flow wings that gave the Tempest its low-altitude advantage. You know about the summer of 1944, when Tempest pilots chased robot bombs across the fields of Kent, flying at treetop height, pushing their aircraft to the absolute limit to save London. You know about Beaumont and Closterman and Berry. You know about the 638 V-1s that never reached their targets. You know about the tipping technique that turns skill into salvation. You know about 122 Wing at Volkel, hunting Me-262Es during takeoff and landing. You know about the 240 aerial victories. And you know that when Sidney Cam drew his line from the Typhoon through the Tempest to the Sea Fury to the Hunter to the Harrier, he wasn't creating separate aircraft. He was building a legacy. Each one a stepping stone, each one connected to what came before and what came after. The Tempest wasn't just Britain's best piston fighter, it was the bridge between eras. The aircraft that proved what CAM's philosophy could achieve and pointed toward the jet age that was about to transform everything. It doesn't get the recognition it deserves, but now at least you're part of the people who know the real story. Go tell someone. Subscribe for more stories like this.